Welcome to the number one friendship podcast in the country. I'm Matt Ritter.
I'm Aaron Cairo.
Guys, go to manoftheyearpodcast.com to check out all of other stuff. We've got some merch. Got to get some of our merch. You got to rock some of our We Should Be Friends shirts. You can go to our YouTube page. I'm excited because we have a very special guest today, and I don't have to just be talking to Cairo, which is always great for both
Find
of
that
us.
interesting, but that's
No,
okay.
you don't. You're very happy about it too. So we are delighted to have her here with us today. She is the editor of NPR's Embedded, and she has a really cool book that we're going to get into that's all about friendship. It's called The Other Significant Others: Reimagining Life with Friendship at the Center, which challenges a lot of conventional norms we have about relationships. Welcome to Man of the Year, Rhaina Cohen.
Thank
Woohoo!
This is a very fun introduction. Just keep pumping me up.
Yeah, no, we are really, really excited to have you. I want to dive right into, I read your book and I found it fascinating. I want to dive right into the question because, a lot of people seem to think that like they don't need friends, or, friends are secondary. We always say on the pod, friendship is the most underserved relationship, but it feels like, you've taken it a lot further than that and you've studied it. It feels like this is a kind of a new dynamic or a new philosophy that we have, that friendship isn't as critical. But looking back historically, it sounds like that's actually not true. Can you talk about that a little bit?
This was one of the biggest revelations for me, that the way that we think about friendship now is not something that has always been this way. And you can look back more than 1,000 years and find that men would go through ceremonies in churches that were, the equivalent basically to marriage ceremonies, or making somebody a godparent, where you would turn someone you were unrelated to into a familial relationship. It was called sworn brotherhood. So you have examples like that. You have in religious texts like the Hebrew Bible, David and Jonathan's commitment to one another. You can fast forward to the 17th through the 19th century, and you have really intimate same-sex friendships that are called romantic friendships, where friends talk about their heart beating for their friend. They would exchange locks of hair. You can look at portraits, especially of men. These are really interesting to see, where their bodies are entangled with each other. There was much more physical affection and emotional intimacy, and friendship was not considered this kind of peripheral relationship, but one where you might find your deepest emotional needs met.
So what happened? I mean, honestly, I'm just like,
Yeah.
how did we get from there to all this feeling that, people just think of it as such an afterthought?
So I think of them there being basically these sort of two strands of reasons. One is that the expectations around marriage have changed a ton. So a few centuries ago, even more recently than that, in a lot of cases, marriage was an economic institution. It was very practical. You are basically gaining in-laws, you're exchanging money. It's kind of like a treaty, except between two families instead of two countries. And the idea that you would be madly in love with your spouse, that you would really connect deeply, was not expected at all. Stephanie Kuntz, who's a historian and has looked at this, said that it was new to have marriage be the basis rather than just a bonus for marriage. And you only see that in sort of the mid 1800s, that's changing. And now, you've probably been to weddings where people talk about their spouse as their best friend. That would have made absolutely no sense in 1801, especially when there's such inequality between men and women. That, like, how are you supposed to have a kind of friendship type of relationship with somebody that you are completely unequal to? Either you are their property, or they are your property. So and so now we are at this point where people really often expect their closest relationship to be with their spouse, for their spouse to be their best friend, and that just doesn't leave very much room for friendship to be very significant. The other thing that goes on over the course of the last sort of century and a half is the ideas of homosexuality and heterosexuality that we have now. The idea that there is a heterosexual person and a homosexual person did not exist as we know it until about the turn of the 20th century. And that meant that there was a lot more freedom for both men and women to be, emotionally intimate with each other, sometimes physically intimate, and for that not to turn them into a certain kind of person. And
Mm,
and there wasn't the same kind of stigma attached to these behaviors. There's a whole like side point about sodomy was still illegal, but it's kind of complicated in terms of how this was sodomy was even defined. So, side note, we can get into like deep history there, but really the gist is that there was a lot more license for especially men. You really see this difference to be close. So then any kind of intimacy between two people of the same sex becomes suspect, and you
mm,
see like censorship of books where there had been emotionally intimate friendships. So you have these kind of twin trends of marriage taking up much more space, and intimacy and friendship becoming really suspect because of the specter of homosexuality.
it's fascinating.
So, so like
Wow.
there's this like trend, I guess you'd say, of scholarship or amateur scholarship that every historical figure was gay. Abraham Lincoln, Julius Caesar. Look at these letters. Look at these things. And what I imagine you're saying is that like no, they were just like broing out, but that's how it was back then.
Oh, I think the answer is something that's complicated. It's we don't know. We don't, it's really hard to look back at some of these cases and know for sure. And I think in some situations, there's you're reading between the lines, and sometimes the reading between the lines is more interpretive, and sometimes it seems like it's more clear cut. But I was just talking to a historian about this yesterday. Who this is his whole area of expertise, and I think there's a lot of good reason to want to look at, to use the labels that we now have and try to see, do people have them in the past, like being queer, being like homosexuality. I mean, I'm bisexual, like this kind of thing I'm invested in. But I think that the problem is that if all you're trying to do is see if people fit into a box that we have now, you're not asking the most interesting questions, which is, like what was different about these relationships? Why is it hard for us to wrap our minds around them right now? In what ways did these relationships actually kind of blur these categories that we now think of as being really separate from one another? So I think the reality is that these people, likely did have sex. Maybe today would have been considered queer, but by no means I don't think that that's everybody. And I also think that it kind of forecloses some of the questions we can ask that really um, encourage us to think a little bit differently about what we take for granted now.
Yeah, I mean, and it's amazing because we're coming at it from we've had this podcast for now 2.5, 3 years, and mostly focused on trying to get men to be more vulnerable and more open with each other. And I definitely see now that a lot of that is based on social norms, stifling social norms that the men can't say I love you to each other. They can't be physically intimate with each other. They're certainly not sharing locks of hair, though Cairo and I should definitely be at the level where we should be sharing.
Except that hair's getting a little gray. It's
No, and
getting
yours is getting, you're wearing a hat to cover. I mean, is that
no,
it's
no,
one
no, no, no.
strand?
I
Is there
get it.
even
It's
a,
short on the
would I
sides
even
is
get
the
a solid
style.
strand out of it?
Short on the sides is the style, has no
Oh
other
my
reasons.
God. But I digress. But so I think what's fascinating about what you're saying is like we really do have a lot to learn. There's a lot to be gleaned there potentially, and mind, and maybe even just there's definitely relationships that were maybe working a lot better. But I also, the other part, what I think you're also saying is that marriages have more pressure. So like there's also this other side of the scale that has now gotten really heavy,
Mhm.
right? We've lightened the load on friendship to almost make it not non-existent for at least a lot of men. And then on the other side of the ledger, now you have all of the weight on the marriages.
Yeah, and it's also not good for the marriages. I mean, there's research showing that people are less happy in their marriages, experience more stress when they don't have other people who they are close to outside of the marriage. So this is, it is understandable that people are trying to find these needs met somewhere, but kind of going all in one place is one, relatively new, and two, it's not necessarily serving most people.
Yeah, because me and Matt always say our number one incoming email is from a woman married to a man who's like, my husband has no friends, or he doesn't ever see them. He doesn't get off the couch. He's so annoying. Like, please help him. And that actually surprised us, but it sounds like it doesn't really surprise you.
Does not at all surprise me. Yeah, yeah. I guess, yeah, I would be interested in like what. So you were surprised by that, but also like it seems like it's bad for both people. Like, aren't the men missing out on connections that can really matter to them? Surely, one person is not going to share all of their interests or be the right person to talk to about every single issue. So there's a loss there on the men's side. And then for the woman, it means that there's pressure on her to always be like the right person for her husband to go to. And it's most likely not going to be reciprocal where she has other outlets, but he doesn't. So it just is kind of a lose-lose situation that I find I'm glad that you guys have the podcast and are like creating a model for men to have different kinds of friendships.
Yeah, we're also trying to disabuse them of these lies that they're telling themselves, right? So one of the big lies that the men are telling themselves is like, I'm fine. I'm a lone wolf. Like, I don't like, I mean, is that even like, I'm curious because you've done all this historical research. Like, where did that come from? This notion that like a man can just be alone and not have any friends. And my other question is, I think we also have to tell women, like, you're wrong. This isn't just his problem. I think a lot of women are like, that's his problem. Like he needs to get a life, right? But I actually think no, you're like what you're saying. We also totally agree with. Like, no, this is going to affect you. This is your life too. So you should maybe get involved if you can, because a lot of times we've been successful getting the women to actually help make the plans for the men, and just even though it's like, oh well, why is that my problem? We're like, well, because he's clearly not like capable at this moment of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand women being like, why do I have to do this? Like, this is the whole point is that I want to not be the one and only person who's being relied upon. I think it helps probably both the man and the woman to realize that the man's behavior is doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not maybe purely out of laziness, but out of um, the accumulation of what culture has been telling him. And also, these are skills. Like, social skills are skills, and knowing how to pursue friendships and maintain them. A lot of it is unspoken, and you're just supposed to intuit it, but it's not that doesn't mean it's straightforward. And if you're not practicing it, those skills are never going to they're either going to atrophy if they ever did exist, or they'll just never develop. So I think having some kind of compassion for the men who are struggling with this, and also for men to not feel like there's something wrong with them if they're having trouble with this. I mean, women also have trouble with making friends. I'm sure you've heard that. I certainly hear that from where I'm sitting. But we're all supposed to treat it as like it's no big deal and it's easy.
And not to get into the men are from Mars debate, but why do you think that women are so much better at friendship than men are? We usually ask everybody that question.
I would amend the question and say, why are women so much better at friendship now than men are? Because when I read texts from the past, you don't see that that men are having a problem with friendship. And in fact, the first essay written was by Michel de Montaigne, and he argued that women were incapable of true friendship. That it was only men who were able to, because women didn't have the right temperament. So and then you can look back at even older thinkers, and they really saw friendship as something that happened between men. So the idea that men are bad at friendship is something that is extremely contemporary, and that indicates that it is not some innate thing about men. And I'm not going to go back to the reverse and say that women are incapable of friendship. I think like the whole point is like, what is the role of society and our culture in telling us what matters, what we're capable of, when are we practicing these things? A lot of men rely on the women in their lives to organize their social the social aspect of their lives, and that means that they're not practicing. And if they you can look at Rates of remarriage after divorce, men are much more likely to get remarried than women are. I mean, without a spouse, often men don't have anybody, and that's not necessarily the case for women. And I just think that so much of this is about socialization. It's about the fear of being perceived as gay that makes men unlikely to get too close to other men, whether or not they recognize that that's a factor. I mean, those are just some of the things that I think are feeding into these differences between men and women.
So I just want to keep like narrowing down on how recent this phenomenon is, because I think that to me is the most shocking thing. I think I kind of had a sense, but from reading the book too, and also from some of our interviews, like we interviewed the rabbi of our temple, and he was like, we had a 350 person thriving men's group 30 years ago. So I'm just wondering if you kind of can pinpoint, like, I think it's very recent, but I'm not exactly sure where and how. Or was it like just this generation, or like, because my parents, Aaron's parents, like he still has a lot of the same friends, right? Your dad has a thriving friend group. I'm just like not sure when and how it happened.
Well, it does. I don't totally like. It's hard to know the exact answer to that question because I don't know if your parents are like in the baby boomers, but certainly my parents and friends, like they don't have good friends. Like it's not like 30 that they would have been the kind of people who would have been in a men's group 30 years ago, but they weren't in it. And so I see a lot of difficulties actually with people that generation. So I mean, I can speculate about the idea that the nuclear family is supposed to be the kind of be all and end all, and maybe people who don't really feel like you're supposed to invest elsewhere. But I think you'd asked previously about some of these ideas about individualism, like those were emerging in the kind of early 20th century. Like Teddy Roosevelt was a kind of classic example of this, like rugged, you can go it alone kind of person. But
Right, rugged
yeah,
individualism they
yeah.
called it, right?
Yeah, I mean, other factors, there's things like the whole bowling alone idea from Robert Putnam. I mean, he has pointed out the way that there's just been this erosion in kind of community organizations, and people that he was tracking television, but now it's not just television, but other reasons why people aren't getting out of the house. But the specific idea of your spouse being your best friend, like that is just the last few decades that has sort of taken off. So I would say that also is a factor that for someone of our parents' generation, they probably would not have expected that, and had other people around. But
Yeah.
it's going to differ from person to person.
I have my personal take, because my wife is like not into any sports stuff, and like we just have like separate interests. So I've never kind of even been on that line of like, oh well, she fills all of my kind of like needs anyway. So I've just always found that comical, that just somehow it just became like, oh well, my wife watches sports with me, so I don't need any, like I'm good now. I don't know. I've always found that a little silly. But like now, like after reading your book, I'm just like, oh yeah, like it's a crazy notion, and I'm glad that it's like, okay, historically that made no sense, and now suddenly it's just something that people are deluding themselves about.
And I think we're seeing some changes. Like that was, I like write a chapter on masculinity, and I feel like that's one of the encouraging things, like seeing that men are talking about about friendship, that men are less at least a lot of them are less concerned with, what will people think if they get too close to another man. So I have some shred of hope that that there will be some recovery here. But I think actually, like, looking to history can be really useful to say that it doesn't, like, the way that we think things are now are not the way that they have to be.
Matt, do you remember, this is many episodes ago, we were talking about rugged individualism, and we coined the term rugged interdependence?
Oh yeah, we did.
What was
We got to push.
how do you define the term?
Well, it's flipping it on its head. Like, it's actually more masculine and healthier to have a lot of friends, have relationships, be vulnerable with your buddies, count on them.
Mhm.
And you can still be rugged and have a great social.
Right. We were like, I think it was also the same. I don't know if it was the same as we were talking about it. Like, oh no, it's more manly and tougher to be able to say I love you to another man than like
Right.
bottling it up,
I
the
mean,
cowardly way.
I also find I don't know, the rugged individualism thing. It's like, well, who's making you dinner? Like, you're dependent on someone. If you're in, like, who is taking care of the children that you have? Like, there was a book that I think it's something something to the effect of like, who made Adam Smith's dinner, and it was about like how he was like very totally. So Adam Smith, this economist who is now sort of held up by libertarians, but he was extremely dependent on his mother to kind of do everything for him. So
That's
yeah, I
amazing.
think that's
That's amazing. Adam Smith's mommy.
Yeah, it's called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner.
Yeah. Oh,
okay.
that's awesome.
I'm just curious because I want to show the book here. We'll show it again at the end. You dug deep. You went. Like Matt. Our audio does not have. I'm not going to have footnotes like this. Any historical stories or quirky things that made it in the book or didn't that you want to share with our audience that piqued your interest?
Now I feel like I'm being quizzed. I'm like, do I know the answer to this? I don't. Well, maybe this is more like a recent history
Yeah.
example. There was a whole bunch of press when I think it was in Saudi Arabia, maybe when President Bush held the hand of the head of state. I think it was either Saudi Arabia or some other
Huh.
country in the Middle East, and there were like explanations in American newspapers about like this is a common thing of men holding hands, and that's true in many places in the world, in India and China. This has been changing over the last few decades. Like I know, people have said that a few decades ago it was extremely common. Now you still see it, but you don't see it quite as much. Where in societies, especially that have been kind of more sex segregated, that and where like the idea of being homosexual is kind of totally behind, like, or of being queer is totally beyond the pale. It sort of has given more room for men to express that kind of affection for each other and for nobody to think twice about it. Not suggesting that what the world we move back to is where being gay is kind of a wild notion for people, but that it's if we can get to a place where people are less concerned about it because it doesn't really, there's no stigma, then there would be more freedom there. What I was thinking of saying is, so I talked to men who had these sorts of friendships, and the kinds of friendships actually that I look at are people who are close enough basically to be life partners. So they're like really pushing at the edge of what a friendship can be. And I think one of the men that I spoke to had a really telling story about how he felt uncomfortable with his certain things that his best friend would do. And this guy Nick grew up conservative, is a pastor, is in a conservative Christian congregation, and and kind of ended up creating this set of questions to evaluate what does he actually want. So for to get, I think it was Matt maybe who said that a lot of men are like, I don't need anybody, or I don't need this kind of closeness. It's like, well, I don't know, do you actually trust what you think you want? So in this case, an example was that Nick felt uncomfortable with his friend putting his arm around his shoulder. And then his friend asked him, okay, let's like go through the set of questions that they came up with, which is what is moral, what is cultural, and what is personal. So they asked, okay, is Nick uncomfortable with this because it's morally wrong? And then they're like, nope, the Bible has like men laying their heads on each other's bosom. Like it's totally fine for men to touch each other. They asked if it was cultural, and Nick thought, well, in his family, like his dad never would sit next to him on the couch. He wouldn't, hug him, didn't tell him he loved him. And he had a lot of sort of reasons in the broader community where it felt like it was wrong to become close to a man. But Nick didn't endorse any of that. And then the last thing was it like, is it personal? And Nick realized like he actually likes his friend having his hand on his shoulder. Like that sensation feels nice to him. And he was able to kind of disaggregate what everybody else was telling him from what he thought that he wanted. And I for something as simple as like having a friend put your hand on your shoulder, but I think it really speaks to some of the things that get in the way of men being really close to each other. And you have to be really thoughtful to interrogate all of those things.
But by the way, that was President Bush holding King Abdullah's hand in 2005.
I
My
don't remember
fact
that
check.
scandal.
Well, it
I don't
sounds
think
like
it was a scandal. It was just more like it needed context for American
right.
audiences because
Right.
it was perplexing.
I think some of it was also that it was holding a Saudi Arabian king's hand after 9/11 or something like that. We don't have to get into that.
That was before they all put their hands on the orb together.
But Matt,
every man's hand on an orb.
yeah, that's less homosexual,
Right,
than,
I guess. I don't know.
so Matt, our friend Shane, he's from Vermont or whatever. He's not waspy, but he's, I don't know, whatever people who are not Jewish are, I don't really understand. But he's basically like, his dad has never hugged him.
Right.
And I'm like, that's ridiculous. I don't believe you. He's like, no, he's never. I'm like, when I meet your dad, I'm getting a hug out of him. Like, I will extract a hug. And he's like, you never will get it. I'm like, if I get a hug, you're taking me to dinner. So his dad is actually visiting LA for the first time in a couple of weeks, and that's Operation Hug Dad.
Oh,
for me.
I don't
Wow.
see it
Wait,
happen. I don't
do
see
you
it.
have a method? Do you have what
You're
is
gonna go bring it in, big guy. Bring it in. Just gonna walk away.
No, I'm gonna be one of my skills, Rhaina, is woo, WOO, winning people over. So I'm just gonna, talk to him, hang out with him, bro out with him, and just honestly probably annoy him, break him down, and then get that hug.
I don't know if it's gonna happen. I don't. Listen, I don't know.
Well-
I can't remember if you know this. My grandmother never hugged me. She was not a hugger.
Well, that's because they're too clumsy.
That was why I spilled things a lot. But no, I think just some people have a lot of walls built up about that stuff, and it's hard for them to just like suddenly overcome it.
I mean, I'm sorry, Rhaina, you go.
No, I wonder with your friend whether as a very young kid his dad hugged him but stopped at a certain point.
Oh, interesting. I mean, maybe when he was like a little, like a baby, but I don't think. I bet you. I'll ask him. I bet you said never.
Yeah.
I bet he never got it.
It's funny we're talking about this now because my dad has passed away, but when he was alive, we would hold hands, and then I just like at some point as a teenager decided I didn't want to do that anymore. And every time he tried to do it, I would like pull my hands away, and I just was thinking about that recently and all this on the pod. I'm like, oh man, I wish I didn't do that, but it's also like, well, that was society influencing. I wish I had taken that quiz.
Right. We can't all be like Tom Brady and kiss our kids in the mouth or whatever he did.
I didn't see that one.
What? Are you kidding me?
Was that a big thing?
This is like 5 years ago. There's like a video of Tom Brady is getting like, he's getting worked on, and his kid comes in. He's like, hey, you didn't say goodbye. And he comes over and kisses him on the lips. I mean, whatever. They love each other, so that's fine. We shouldn't make fun. Obviously, that's going.
No, that was the whole SNL sketch of like people think that's weird. So they did. I don't know if you've seen that recurring SNL sketch where a friend comes over the house and everybody's kissing on the mouth.
Oh yeah.
It becomes this like elevated thing. But yeah, it is interesting. We just have all of these norms, and I think other countries, not just historically, right? I think we didn't even get into the fact that other countries have wildly different norms about friendships and relationships. And I think the nuclear family, that we didn't really touch on that much. I do think that has had a big influence on, because at least from what my thesis is kind of like a lot of men of our generation just think their role was like to get a good job, make money and get married and have a family. And then they're set. Like that's the whole like circle of success. You've arrived, and friendship is nowhere even in the circle. So that, of course, it's natural for them to be like, I'm good. I did it. Then suddenly they wake up around 35 or 40 with this like nagging itch to build friendships again. And it's like, I don't know what to do.
I mean, I've seen this happen both with men and women. I can think of like a specific conversation I had with someone who was like, I don't have time for friends. I have a kid, I've got my family, I've got work, like that is more than enough. And then found herself going through a hard situation and being like wishing that she had more people around, more friends around her, that she was less isolated, especially in parenthood. So I do think that we're kind of sold a bill of goods that just having a few people is supposed to be They're really, I mean, maybe just having a spouse alone, that's supposed to be enough. And in fact, I'm going through a process of trying to build basically like a friend compound type of situation with some friends. And we went and visited a house that we were considering buying, and the real estate agent was like so confused because there were like 6 or 8 of us adults, and he was like trying to figure out who would live here, and asked if we wanted to have kids. And we talked about, yeah, that's like one of the main reasons, like several of us want to have kids. And then I could just like see him have an epiphany in real time where he was like, oh, like I have several kids, but my, you could just have the kids entertain each other and then you hang out with each other. And he said that he would try to hang out with his friends and they would say like, aren't your wife and kids enough? Or like, don't you love your wife and kids? And that it was such I found that sad that that's how his friends responded to him. And also that, it had never occurred to him that it was okay to have friends be more involved in his life. That wasn't sort of the thing that he was told, was even on the table.
Yeah, it's amazing. I just rented an office space, and just because they're not like used to having, people do with their friends and their wives' friends. So I just was like, let me just do the lease. And then like it's me and a buddy, and sometimes my wife comes, sometimes his wife comes, sometimes our kids comes. And the guy was immediately like, what's going on in here? What kind of game are you trying to run? I'm like, no, this is just like our situation, So he was like, all right, well, you just gotta reserve the conference room if people are going to be in it. I could tell he wasn't like really upset about it. He was just, he couldn't conceive of what we were like, that, oh, I'm renting an office and my buddy's using it and my wife's using it and his wife's using it and like all this stuff.
Too many people. Keep it simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on the landlord side. Like, an office is for work. Like, why are your friends there? Why are your kids there? Grow up.
No, no. Grow up. Grow up.
Matt does not like an ad hominem attack.
Yeah.
Rhaina, where can we find you? Where can our listeners find you or find the book?
So you can find the book wherever books are sold. It's called The Other Significant Others: Reimagining Life with Friendship at the Center. I also write periodically for The Atlantic, in addition to my NPR work. And if you listen to Embedded, you'll hear stuff. I'm on the other side of the audio. I edit and produce there. And then you can find me on Substack and on Instagram. My name is first name is spelled unusually, so I'm easy to find. Rhaina.
Well, thank you so much. This was enlightening. I highly encourage people to read the book because I think it'll blow your mind and just kind of change your entire conception of, what friendship is and what relationships are supposed to be, based on historical precedent. So thank you again, Rhaina.
Rhaina, thank you so much. Guys, buy the book. I'm holding it right now. Thank you so much for listening. Always remember, be good to yourself, be good to your friends. Hey, Matt, I love you, buddy.
Love you, buddy.